Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 12th of January 2023. Today we have some updates, so let's start. First we're going to start with Solidar, of course. When talking about the Western Sources map, as you can see they have updated this map a little bit. And tell the truth, this map shows almost the real front line that we have today. But let's talk about the Russian source map. As you can see, there are some differences and there are a lot of icons in this area. As you can see, the Russian source map has been updated as well. The Russians shows that they established real control over the total control, the final control over Solidar. Furthermore, today the Russians published a lot of video how they entered this part of Solidar, and some Russian military experts are saying that the Russians also managed to enter or to establish some position in the salt mine number 7. This is the western, the farthest salt mine in Solidar, this one. As you can see, this is a very powerful fortification industrial area. The Ukrainians have their position there, and the Ukrainians, of course, tries to slow down, stop the Russians, and not to allow them to establish control over Blagodatne. When talking about this map, we see that the Russians don't have control over Krasnogora. The Russians didn't manage to enter Praskovyevka. The Russians very far from Blagodatne. If you remember, during the storm of Solidar agglomeration, Solidar and the town around this town, there were a lot of speculations, lots of talks, a lot of rumors about the fact that the Russians managed to enter Praskovyevka, that they were attacking Blagodatne. I believe that all those things were connected mainly with artillery strikes, and sometimes when people were talking about artillery strikes, sometimes they translated these attacks as maybe some ground operation or something like this. So the front line that you see on the Russian sources map, and I'm talking about the gray line because I believe that at this moment we need to discuss the situation on the ground according to the gray line. I'm not saying that the Russians have established control over the area between the gray line and the green line, but I believe that this is the real front line. The Russians attacks, the Russians in offensive state, and the Ukrainians now try to hold their positions in these small towns around Solidar. Furthermore, when talking about Krasnogor and Paraskovyevka, to be more precise, when talking about Paraskovyevka, today, the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, during the report, they're doing their own report every single day as well as the Russians. And the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine reported that today it was the first day when they managed to repulse the offensive operation from the Russians' side in direction of Paraskovyevka. So that means that the Russians may be somewhere between these towns. Maybe they have some positions in this small Yegidne, this town that's located on the west from Podgorodny, or maybe they have entered the south outskirts of Paraskovyevka and Krasnogora. Very difficult to understand because not much time left since the Solidar offensive operation, and I believe that we need some time and before the fog of war disappears from this area. But anyway, a lot of things we know for sure for today on the 12th of January. And the most important one is that Solidar is under Russian control. A lot of talks, a lot of rumors, a lot of things, a lot of discussions were about the salt mines in Solidar and ammo depot that Ukrainians managed to deploy or establish in those salt mines. And some Russian sources are saying that there are still a lot of ammo and a lot of shells in these salt mines that located under Solidar. And of course, the Russians managed to establish control over some ammo depot. But the most important thing that the Russians are saying, and the Western sources confirms as well, that a lot of Ukrainian soldiers who were fighting in Solidar during the previous days, during the Solidar defense operation, managed to rescue, to save their lives, and they went down inside these salt mines. So I'm not saying I don't know the real number of the Ukrainians who managed to evacuate or to manage to go down in these salt mines, but today the Russians provided the first number that according to the Russian source, according to the Russian understanding of the situation, there are around 200 Ukrainian soldiers who are still in Solidar, to be more precise, who are hiding in the salt mines. Solidar is a very important town. These guys in salt mines are not going to surrender, as I understand. And today, a lot of Russian military experts confirmed that Ukrainians made another attempt of counter-offensive operation in direction of Solidar. The main thing that these soldiers were trying to do is to, first of all, penetrate and to break through the Russians in this area, and to deblock these Ukrainian soldiers who these days are blocked in the salt mines. The Russians are saying that during this attempt of counter-offensive operation from the Ukrainian side, the Ukrainians lost around 200 soldiers, and they couldn't deblock the Ukrainians who are hiding in the salt mines. I don't think that it is a very good idea to start counter-offensive operation from the Ukrainian side with the purpose to deblocate 200 soldiers if you receive a result of losing of your own 200 soldiers. So for now it's like zero. You want to rescue 200, but you lost another 200 and you didn't achieve any success. So that means that if you are planning to start another offensive operation, that means that sooner or later you will have a minus on your balance. So I think that maybe the Russians try to speculate on this situation about some kind of counter-offensive operation from the Ukrainian side, or maybe there are much more Ukrainians who are hiding in the salt mines under Solidar, or there is something very important in these salt mines that Ukrainians understand they need to return control over. Now, when talking about Solidar from the west, from the perspective of the Western sources map, we need to understand that Solidar is very important. We discussed a lot about the dangerous situation that Seversk appeared right now, and the entire front line on the north from Solidar might collapse very soon if the Russians are able to develop any offensive operation in this area and to develop the bridgehead in this area. It will be something like automatic collapse of Seversk if the Russians are able to establish control over the towns that located around Solidar. And I'm talking about few, let's say, objects. First of all is, and the most important, at least at this stage of Russian offensive operation, is the salt mine number 7, this one. This is a very interesting area. As we discussed, the Russians managed to enter this residential area, and maybe they blocked the salt mine from the south, from the west, and from the north. But for now, the Ukrainians still hold salt mine. This salt mine has a lot of underground caves, and some sources are saying that the exit from these underground caves you might find somewhere even in Paraskovivka, so very far from this to the south. So if it's true, if there is underground caves, underground tunnels that connects, let's say, Solidar and with Bakhmut, that means that the Russians might have a lot of problems, and the Ukrainians are able to supply and support salt mine number 7 for a very long time, because you don't need to, you can use the underground tunnels to make rotation process and so on, and it's possible to hold this area for a very long time. Another area where the Ukrainians tries to stop and slow down the Russians is the railroad station by the name of Sol, this one. And this is some kind of reserve base, and if salt mine number 7 falls, the Ukrainians understand that they might have possibility to slow down the Russians on the railroad station Sol. Of course, when talking about more checkpoints on the north, another railroad station, Krasnopopovka. This is a very small railroad station. I believe that it's the weakest point in Ukrainian defense orders. The only powerful side of this fortification is that this fortification is located very far from the roads, from the towns. So I'm not sure that the Russians are able to use these fields to attack this fortification, because they will got under crossfire. There are a lot of mines. These fields are mined. And so for now, it's the weakest point, but there are a lot of powerful benefits to protect this Krasnopopovka. When talking about south, of course, there is another fortification, Blagodatne. this one, and Ukrainians uses these positions just with one purpose, to pin down the Russians who has their position in the residential area on the south of salt mine number 7. So they are not giving any opportunities for the Russians to cross the railroad arcade and to encircle this salt mine from the south and from the west. So this is the main job, and furthermore, as you can see, there is a natural barrier that protects Blagodatne from crossing and from attacks. So it's a very important position in Blagodatne, and I believe that Ukrainians will try to use this area. And this is even the key region. There are not much buildings, not much places to hide, but there are some residential areas. So I believe that there is a road that connects salt mine number 7. So I believe that Ukrainians, it's a base of the Ukrainian defense in this area. So it will be very difficult to take control over salt mine number 7 without taking Blagodatne, or at least without ruining all these buildings till zero and destroying all artillery positions that Ukrainians might have, mortar positions that Ukrainians might have in this area. Of course, a lot of talks, there is a fog of war above Krasnogora. There were a lot of updates about the fact that the Russians managed to take control over some checkpoints and so on. As you can see, there is an icon shows that the Russians made few attempts of offensive operation in this area, but and during the offensive operation in Soledar, some Russian military experts were saying that Krasnogora was taken by the Russians completely, but as we understand, as we see today, after a few days of these cruel clashes in Soledar, we see that Krasnogora remains under Ukrainian control. But the Russians do able to take control over this town because there are no barriers. I believe that there are no mines in front of this town, or they were already detonated or demined by the Russians. Furthermore, as I understand, the Russians have some positions between this triangle of three towns, like Yagidne, this town, like Paraskovik and Krasnogora. So they are somewhere there. They control this cross. They have this forest, some brushes. So I believe that the Russians do have position there. And from these positions, the Russians try to attack Paraskovivka, Krasnaya Gora, and of course, I'm not sure that the Russians, at least at this time, try to develop anything in direction of Yagidne. For now, they need to fix and to establish control over Paraskovivka and Krasnaya Gora. Furthermore, when talking about the Russians, yesterday they published a very interesting article, and they were saying that Paraskovivka has the biggest salt mine ever. It's ex-salt mine. The salt mine is closed right now, and even in 80s or even in 70s, during the USSR times, the Soviet authorities decided to establish some warehouse, and they moved a lot of artillery shells, a lot of ammo, a lot of everything they had in Kakut in this salt mines. And some Russian sources are saying that there are still a lot of weapons in these salt mines, and this is the reason why this area is so important. And I'll repeat one more time, there is some kind of talks and rumors, maybe, I don't know, that all these salt mines, like in Paraskovivka and Soledar, are connected. Of course, it's not a very good thing, because if these mines are connected, that means that even if the Russians are able to take, let's say, the highest levels of this salt mine, and if they decide to continue their offensive operation, anytime the Ukrainians are able to attack them in their back. So all these salt mines is not a joke. All these salt mines still are dangerous. I believe you saw a lot of videos how the head of Wagner's visited these salt mines, but you need to understand that he visited just the top level of these salt mines. They are very deep in the ground, and nobody knows how many Ukrainian soldiers are there, what is their main goal, what are they expecting for, and maybe it might be some kind of trap. It might be, of course, some kind of speculation from my side, but today's attempt of counter-offensive operation in this area, and a lot of updates from the Russian side that Ukrainians, after moving forces from Soledar, now these days trying to make some kind of regroup, after reports that the president of Ukraine ordered to deploy more reserves in this area, and after a lot of rumors and talks about the fact that Ukrainians are planning to start counter-offensive operation in Soledar, everything might happen. The Ukrainians understand the value of Solidar. This Solidar is located on the high land in comparison with Bakhmut, and from these positions the Russians are able to collapse Seversk front line. The Russians are able to collapse the Bakhmut as well, and a lot of military experts are saying that without Solidar it will take just weeks, not even months, before Bakhmut is going to fall without Solidar. Furthermore, very interesting updates are coming from the Western Sources map. As you can see, the Western Source map has been updated. As you can see, Dibrovo and the small town Kuzmina that located on the west from Kremina is under Ukrainian control, as you can see according to this map. This map is completely different in comparison with the Russian source map. As you can see according to this map, the Russians still control this area, and furthermore they try to develop their offensive operation in direction of Tarskoye. Yesterday they published a lot of video of clashes in the forests in this area, so there is a lot of mass, a lot of balagan. But when talking about this area, the Russians reported that during the previous 24 hours the Ukrainians lost around 100 soldiers in this area. And when we talk about Liman area, this is a very interesting update. Today, according to the Russian sources, on Liman front line, and when talking about Liman front line, the Russians are saying that this is like the area from Seversky Donetsk area until Stelmakhovka. So this line from Stelmakhovka to Liman is the Liman front line, and everything that on the north from Stelmakhovka is the Kupiansk front line. So Liman front line is very big, as you can see, maybe the biggest in this special operation. If I'm talking about today, the Ukraine lost 100 soldiers. When talking about yesterday, the Ukrainians on this front line lost 90 soldiers. When talking about the day before yesterday, just 40, and then again 60 soldiers, then 50, then so when we compare Liman front line with other front lines, we see that this is the front line where we can find the heaviest losses from the Ukrainian side, maybe after Bakhmut. But when talking about the Ministry of Defense, this is the front line where the Ukrainians have the heaviest losses, because as we know, the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation, they don't include the numbers of losses of Ukrainians in the clashes with the Wagners, because Wagners is not under control or in front of responsibilities in front of Ministry of Defense. They have their orders, they have their own plans. Of course, they coordinate their operations, but the numbers are not included. So when talking about Liman, furthermore, the Russians reported that Ukrainians lost around 5 commandos on Kupiansk-Liman front line. The commandos were destroyed mainly on the Kupiansk front line. The Russians activated in Dibrovo as well. The Russians continue effective artillery duels in this area. As the result of that duel, the Ukraine lost 1 Grad system in Kupiansk, and I believe that that's it about the Kupiansk. So as we discussed, the Ukrainians were forced to deploy another M77 in Lazova, this town. But as we discussed, the Ukrainians were forced to deploy a lot of artillery systems on Bakhmut front line just to slow down the Russians. But anyway, this is not enough. The ratio of losses is 1-7 or 1-10 when comparing the Ukrainians and the Russians' artillery work in this area. So I don't know what the Ukrainians are planning to do, to tell the truth. It's very difficult for them. They were right in front of starting of the greatest offensive operation in Crimea, but all their plans were ruined, and the Russians are saying that Ukrainians started regrouping. They moved a lot of forces from Liman in direction of Seversk, just for 2 purposes, we understand. The first one, to hold the front line in Seversk, to reinforce the Ukrainians near Solidar, to organize some counter-offensive operation in this area. And the second reason why the Ukrainians started moving forces from Kupiansk-Liman front line in direction of Seversk is just to be on the safe side. So if they understand that everything collapses and everything falls, at least they will have possibilities to retreat from Kupiansk-Liman Seversk front line with the last losses and to reduce the losses. So now the Ukrainians don't think about offensive operation, at least by March, because we know that just in March they will receive armored vehicles, tanks and so on from the Western countries, and after that they will be able to start offensive operation or to start doing something. Now they're thinking just about how to reduce the losses during the regrouping, because I believe that these days we're going to see if the Ukrainians smart, they need to start regrouping process. They need to cross this line. They need to do this. They need to have experience in this, because till today we saw just or the global defeat and running of the Ukrainians from the front line or effective offensive operation. They need to develop, they need to have experience also in the regrouping, as the Russians have, because the Russians are masters in regrouping. They did a lot of regroups with very low losses. For now, the Ukrainians don't have such experience. When talking about Donetsk area, when continue Donetsk, about Bakhmut, the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation and many other sources confirmed that Opotna is now under Russian control. And this is very important because we discussed this, that there are a lot of high buildings in the Opotna, and now as soon as the Russians establish control over these high buildings, there are just very low residential area, and there are no problems. There are a lot of problems always, but at least there are less problems for the Russians to establish control or to stop movements in the south of Bakhmut through Opotna. When talking about Klishchiivka, the Russians reported that it controls around 30% of this town. This information, I believe, is confirmed. Yes, this information confirmed by the Western country maps and so on. So if the Russians are able to take Klishchiivka, and I believe they are able, we can say that Bakhmut will fall very soon after fall of Klishchiivka, after clearing of, let's say, Bakhmut, Krasnogora, so it will be just a matter of days, not even weeks or not even months. When talking about Donetsk, there are no changes. As you can see, the Ukrainians attack Donetsk heavily, trying to reduce or maybe to change the Russian focus as they did before. When talking about Marinka, the same situation. The Russians try to develop their offensive operation in Marinka. They tried to attack Pobeda, but without any progress, without any success. The same situation in Ugledar. I believe that a few days in a row, we received updates about some activation. But for now, nothing more. Just the artillery duels in this area. The Russians continue effective artillery duels. As you can see, they destroyed one Gvozdika near Velika Novoselovka, another Gvozdika in Orekhov. So they continue their offense, their artillery duels, and they're pretty successful. When talking about Donetsk, the South Donetsk area, the Ukrainians lost just 30 soldiers and something like 5 armored vehicles. When talking about Donetsk, the Ukrainians lost something around 70 soldiers and around 8 armored vehicles. So as you can see, I believe that Solidar still remains the most important area. If the Ukrainians want to fix the situation, they need to start counter-offensive operation, but they need resources for this. And the real risk of offensive operation, counter-offensive operation against Solidar is that they can burn all the rest of their reserves. And don't forget the most important part. I'm repeating this situation almost every single video. Don't forget that when talking about Solidar, when talking about Bakhmut, we are talking about Wagners. And if there are losses among the Russians, we are talking about the losses among Wagners. We are not talking about losses among professional Russian army. We still haven't seen the Russian army in action. And this is the most important, and this situation scares me a lot. We see the real collapse in Solidar, where the professional Ukrainian army from 77th Brigade that they managed just to collect after trainings in Western countries and deploy on the front line. We're talking about 46th Brigade that also were trained on the Western countries. The Ukrainians burned a lot of their reserves, professional army, in the battles with Wagners. I'm not saying that the Wagners are unprofessional. They're maybe more professional than the Ukrainians. I'm just saying that we still haven't seen Russian army in action. And anyway, we are going to see the Russian army in action. And this situation are confirmed by yesterday appointment of Gerasimov as the head of special operation. And today we got another update. You know that Gerasimov, the head of special operation and commander-in-chief of Russian army, had two vice heads of his army. The first one is Surovikin, the ex-head of special operation. Now he's his vice. And the second one is the head of infantry. And today the head of infantry visited Belarus. And he started some kind of check of the Russian army that deployed in Belarus, of the Union army in Belarus, deployed in Belarus. Furthermore, don't forget that today we have a lot of talks, a lot of, discussions, furthermore, about deployment of Russian forces in the territory of Belarus. Today we saw another convoy of tanks, railroad convoys of tanks, of vehicles that were deployed on the territory of Belarus. Furthermore, don't forget that today the Western countries are saying that the Ukrainians were forced to deploy a lot of forces on the border with Belarus because they understand that the army that were deployed in Belarus is very big. And when we were talking about this army, let's say months ago, we were talking about the fact that this army weren't at that moment months ago, weren't able to start the greatest offensive operation from the Belarus, but a month ago we were saying, and that this information was confirmed by the Western countries, that this army was able to solve a tactical goals, tactical plans. So they weren't able to start broad frontline attack from the border, but let's say they were able to establish control over Korostin, over small towns like Sarnin, to cut some supply road. So a month has passed since that time. More forces were deployed. And when talking about today, I don't think that this army are just able to solve small tactical like issues or small tactical goals. I believe that they are able to complete some strategic goals on this front line. Because what is the reason to deploy such a big army on the territory of Belarus if you're not planning to attack? If you want just to pin down and freeze the Ukrainian forces, I believe that 60, 70,000 or 50,000 is enough. But we see more and more convoys that arrives on the territory of Belarus, and when you have plans to liberate or return control over Donbass and the towns in this area, why do you need to deploy your reserves so far from this area? Just to freeze and pin down the Ukrainians? Something tells me that this is not the only goals that the Russians are trying to achieve in Belarus. Maybe they have something more. They want to do to have something more. And that's it for today. Military Summer channel reminds you to condemn any violence in Ukraine. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.